Bien, alors nous reprenons le cours de notre journée d'études avec cet après-midi, pour la première tranche horaire, la conférence de Jane Gordon. Et c'est Yannick Blec qui de nouveau va assurer la présentation de la conférence de cet après-midi, du travail de Jane Gordon. Et ce sera suivi immédiatement après quelques questions-réponses, par la communication de Assia Daman sur la francophonie transculturelle et la construction de l'hybridité. Je passe donc tout de suite la parole à Yannick Blec pour la présentation de Jane Gordon et de son travail.
Donc, nous allons, comme l'a dit M. Rocky, commencer cet après-midi par la conférence de Jane Gordon, que nous avons le plaisir d'accueillir. Une conférence placée sous le signe de la créolisation. Ce phénomène transculturel me parle à plus d'un titre. Il est le produit de la rencontre, de la collusion, de la collision, du rapprochement de plusieurs cultures, des cultures coloniales françaises, britanniques et hispaniques, des rites et des rythmes animistes d'Afrique de l'Ouest, des croyances indiennes. Il est le fruit d'une mise en relation, pour reprendre Glissant, qui s'applique à ce qu'il appelait le tout-monde. Glissant écrivait « Le monde se créolise ». La créolisation n'est pas uniquement un processus décrivant la transformation de cultures, de groupes sociaux s'altérant au contact des uns des autres. C'est aussi un concept philosophique et un outil épistémologique éprouvé au plus près de l'expérience vécue et du combat politique. Sa théorisation permet également de proposer des alternatives aux méthodologies disciplinaires dominantes, et c'est ce dont Jane Gordon nous parlera dans un instant. Jane Gordon est Associate Professor de sciences politiques et d'études africaines américaines à the University of Connecticut. Elle a précédemment enseigné à Temple University de 2008 à 2013. Elle est aussi présidente de la Caribbean Philosophical Association depuis 2013. Elle est l'auteure de Why They Couldn't Wait, A Critique of Black Jewish Conflicts over Community Control in Ocean Hill, Brownsville, 1967-1971. Elle a co-dirigé avec Louis R. Gordon A Companion to African American Studies, ainsi que Not Only the Master's Tool, African American Studies in Theory and Practice, publié chez Paradigme en 2006, et co-écrit Of Divine Warning, Reading Disaster in the Modern Age, avec Lewis Gordon toujours. En janvier 2014, elle publiait Creolizing Political Theory, Reading Rousseau through Fanon. Jane Gordon est spécialiste des théories sociales et politiques, de la pensée politique noire, de l'esclavage contemporain, des méthodologies en sciences sociales également. Dans une pratique transdisciplinaire, Jane Gordon étudie les identités politiques, c'est-à-dire ces identités sociales qui définissent des groupes dont les membres s'allient pour lutter contre des injustices, des formations qui visent à obtenir la liberté politique et sociale de membres spécifiques qui sont mis à la marge de la société dominante. Dans son travail, elle montre les différentes possibilités de transfert qui existent lorsque des communautés dissemblables sont confrontées les unes aux autres et qu'une forme de cohésion se met en place, des échanges ou des alliances contre un opposant ou un ennemi commun. Cette créolisation de l'identité politique, un échange transculturel et transidentitaire, est l'objet central de la recherche de Jane Gordon. Elle constate, comme elle nous le démontrera dans sa conférence, que la créolisation n'est pas un élément géographiquement localisé. Pour elle, il s'agit de mettre en avant un processus complexe qui va au-delà du simple mimétisme auquel le terme créole a d'abord été associé. C'est la création d'une culture identitaire à part entière, à travers d'abord la juxtaposition, puis à la fois l'homogénéisation et l'hétérogénéisation des cultures. Pour que le procédé de créolisation soit complet, et c'est ici que se situe la différence que Gordon apporte, il ne doit pas subordonner une culture sur une autre, ni une identité par rapport à une autre. La créolisation, pour Yannick Blec, est aussi un outil primordial dans une approche contemporaine de la recherche en sciences humaines. Dans un article de 2008 intitulé « The Grammars of Monotheism and Polytheism, Reading Descent through an Insight from Hannah Arendt », elle mettait déjà en évidence la nécessité d'une approche plurielle, c'est-à-dire ne s'attendant pas que sur une discipline ossifiée et décadente pour l'analyse des identités politiques. Dans cet article, Jane Gordon relie les identités politiques aux principes de monothéisme et de polythéisme. Elles mettent en avant la nécessité d'ouverture de la critique en sciences humaines en allant d'une méthodologie unidisciplinaire vers une autre transversale. Cela permettrait ainsi, selon elle, de remettre en question l'hégémonie d'une entité politique et sociale dominante en étendant les axes qui permettent d'aborder le pouvoir. Son dernier ouvrage, Creolizing Political Theory, Reading Rousseau through Fanon, publié en janvier 2014, va plus loin dans la démarche de créolisation de la théorie politique. La créolisation qu'elle y développe n'est pas uniquement géographique, elle est aussi temporelle. En faisant transparaître le rapport qui existe entre Jean-Jacques Rousseau et Frantz Fanon, Gordon se garde toutefois de créer un lien factice entre les idées et les idéaux des deux penseurs. Il s'agit, en fait, de relier les principes révolutionnaires du contrat social, de Rousseau, et la décolonisation prônée par Frantz Fanon. Dans l'introduction de ce livre, elle insiste en effet sur le fait que Fanon est, je cite, « bien plus que du Rousseau appliqué ». Fin de citation. Il y a ce dépassement de la pensée rousseauiste chez Fanon qui créolise les idéaux et les orientations du philosophe des Lumières dans sa réflexion politique en appliquant à l'Algérie coloniale, en les appliquant à l'Algérie coloniale, en réfléchissant sur la position de l'homme noir dans la société occidentale et en poursuivant le travail sur la volonté générale, la société, la liberté et l'égalité. C'est donc la créolisation de la philosophie politique et des identités politiques que Yannick Blec explique dans son travail, dont elle nous présente maintenant une partie dans sa conférence intitulée « Creolizing Political Identity as a Pursuit of Knowledge and Understanding ».
So first, thank you. Thank you. Thank you to Jean-Paul. And I know that it's always hard to pay attention when your belly is full. So I hope that it'll be interesting enough to make that process easier. So I'm going to begin in the reverse of what Lucille did, which is I'm going to begin by talking about why the creolization of political theory and method seemed necessary, because it emerged in many ways as a dilemma out of very concrete situations. Yeah. So there are three that I'll talk about very briefly. The first was where Yannick just finished, which was when I was a student of political theory. In some ways, in the spirit of this meeting, I hadn't studied political theory prior to my doctoral work. I'd studied history and education and Jewish studies and Black studies. And so in some ways, I was undisciplined. And so I read the works that one is supposed to read as a student of political theory, in some ways fresh. And what struck me when I read Rousseau, and then when I read Frantz Fanon, was that Frantz Fanon took the ideas that I considered most politically important in Rousseau and transformed them for the contemporary world. And it struck me, and what I mean by that is, while Rousseau diagnosed many things that were profoundly wrong with the modern world, he ultimately could not imagine a world beyond Europe. And so all he could do in the face of those was to look backwards. And so in many ways, if Europe couldn't realize the future that he hoped for, then no one could. Whereas for Fanon, that was not the option that he could take. He had to imagine a world to come in which something like the social contract could be meaningfully realized. And yet what I realized very quickly is that for all of my mentors, coupling these figures, saying that Fanon is the inheritor, the most important inheritor of what Rousseau has done, is undisciplined, it's unacceptable. It's not an argument that one can make. If you're interested in Rousseau, you have to read Kant. You have to read Habermas. You have to read John Rawls. You don't turn to Martinique, right? That's a different trajectory and an illicit trajectory. But then it occurred to me that if what we're supposed to do is do justice to these ideas, then there must be something wrong with the training that I was receiving, that I was being discouraged from seeing what was very obvious, right? So that was one of the initial impetuses, is what does it mean if one's training discourages you from seeing what you actually see, right? And then the second two moments that were an inspiration for this work, or really that posed the difficulties that I was trying to think through in the work, were the Caribbean Philosophical Association and then Cadestria in Senegal, right? The Caribbean Philosophical Association, as Louis mentioned earlier, is an organization that was founded by many people who do theoretical work in a range of disciplines, but who rejected the idea that philosophy and universal ideas can only emerge from the European world. Right? But one of the things that we took very seriously in the organization was that if we were going to do constructive theorizing, if we were going to generate philosophy, we had to do it in a way that didn't continue the contours of the colonial world. So one of the first questions that we faced was a linguistic one. The Caribbean is a tiny region. I mean, it's spread, but it's not very big, right? But it's entirely divided linguistically among those who speak French and those who speak Spanish and those who speak English and those who speak Dutch and those who speak Portuguese. And the scholarly communities are equally insulated. They don't speak to one another. And we decided very early on in the organization that we couldn't duplicate that. We needed to do something different, right? And similarly, at the level of method, many of the people who study the Caribbean they're scholars of literature, they're scholars of history, or they're scholars of linguistics, or even though many of the times the major Caribbean figures who we study did all of these things. If you think about Frantz Fanon or C.L.R. James, they were creative writers. They wrote about language, they wrote about history, they wrote about sociology. And so there was a sense in which we were doing an injustice to the spirit of the people who we were trying to study and build from. And so it was very clear that we needed to develop a method that was actually suitable to what it was that we were trying to do. And then lastly, with Cadestria, the organization in Senegal, right? The organization took the position that it's one thing to win political independence. It's quite another to develop intellectual independence, epistemological independence, and as Louis would add, normative independence. And so the organization developed precisely to do that, but to do that had to make a question of what it is that we're doing when we study the world at all, right? And one of the reasons why I had begun by studying Rousseau, and then it had led to Fanon, was that Rousseau is fundamentally suspicious of scholarly inquiry, right? I mean, for him, the project of the university is absolutely wrapped up in the project of empire. And so even it doesn't mean one can't undertake such work, but you always have to do so with a very fundamental suspicion, right? And a question of what am I doing and for what purpose, right? And yet, if one wanted to do this work in the US and the Anglophone world more generally, if you pose questions of difference or inequality or racism or colonialism or enslavement, the model that one's always encouraged to use is multiculturalism, right? And there are many ways in which multiculturalism is a very important model. At the very least, it takes seriously that there are multiple worlds within a nation, right? But the difficulty with multiculturalism is it's based in a fundamentally misleading conception of what culture is, right? The way that, it's funny, for lunch you said buffet, right? Multiculturalism imagines culture as a buffet, right? There's this, there's this, there's this, there's this, and you pick, you know? But they're supposed to be very separate. There's supposed to be very clear boundaries among the cultures that are there. And you respect those cultures and the people who are members of them or who inhabit and embody them by treating them as semi-sovereign, right? So you respect what it is to be Lebanese by letting someone be Lebanese and leaving them alone. And you respect someone who's Dominican by studying them to a certain extent and leaving them alone. But underlying that is a sense that none of those cultures are supposed to, in fact, change at all the hegemonic political culture in which everybody is enmeshed. So in the United States, liberal democracy, liberal capitalism democracy remains intact. It's not supposed to be porous. It's also on the smorgasbord, on the buffet table. It's just a very large dish, right? And everything else encircles it. And linked to that is also an idea of assimilation, right? That in the United States, ultimately, to become a citizen is to assimilate, right? And to assimilate into a version of white citizenship where you have to shed everything else that you are, right? So to become a US citizen, you're really supposed to leave at the door the other forms of meaningful belonging that really make you who you are, precisely because the hegemonic culture would never reflect them. You can practice them in private, sure, but there's no conception at all that the US Constitution or US law should change with the people who make up the society, right? I mean, it has to make minor accommodations here and there, but it's not actually a porous document, a porous political culture, right? So the reason that I began to turn to Creolization was actually when I first visited Jamaica. Yeah, and the reason why was the image of assimilation was very, very different in that context. And what I mean by that is that what it was that everybody assimilated into was blackness, right? And so one of the things that struck me most when I was in Jamaica was there were people who looked exactly like me, who thought of themselves as black and a variety of other things. And so what that posed as a question for me was the point about social arithmetic that I make in the essay that we distributed. And that's that when you aim for whiteness, the whole point of it is it's exclusive. You have to get rid of everything else to be able to embody it, to be able to exhibit its qualities, right? But one of the things that's striking about blackness, and even an image of assimilating into blackness, is that you can be black and a variety of other things, right? And so the argument that I was, it's actually Alexis Noose, he's French and he taught in Montreal and now he's back in Wales. He makes this argument about a social arithmetic, right? And he's reflecting on the US culture. You typically, if you teach undergraduates at the United States and you ask, you know, who are you? They'll say, I'm 25% this, I'm 50% this, you know, and the idea is it has to add up to 100, right? That a whole person is 100%. And so if you're 50% this, it only leaves 50% to be anything else, right? And what Alexis Noose said is that may be fine when we're talking about a pizza or, you know, or a quiche, but it doesn't make any sense when we're talking about a human being, right? That if you're female, you're 100% female. And if you're Lebanese, you're 100% Lebanese. And it may be something that you're actually only distantly related to that's a very significant part of who you are, right? I mean, I may only be something through a great-grandparent that really shapes my sense of who I am and what I'm to do in the world. But the point is, it doesn't all have to add up to 100%. We can be 600%, 800%, right? But the same argument goes for methodology, right? Because the reason for the detour through the discussion of culture is that one of the things that I realized when I was doing this work is the way that we envision culture, if we envision it as a smorgasbord, we tend to also think about disciplines that way, right? And so interdisciplinarity is a lot like multiculturalism, right? When interdisciplinarity is done well, the idea is the historian comes to the table, the linguist comes to the table, the student of literature comes to the table, and they're a good contributor if they're a very loyal one, right? If they bring literature as literature scholars bring it to the table, and if they bring history as history, the idea is that they're supposed to bring this item unchanged by the relationship that they're about to engage in, right? They bring it as purities. But this is a problematic way of thinking about each of these things, because again, you have to be exclusively this and shed all of these other things. And yet, as all of you know, as scholars of anything, right? Why should you shed anything when you approach a question or a problem that interests you? Because it's highly likely linked to questions and commitments that are very profoundly yours. Otherwise, you wouldn't be devoting your life to studying them. And so there's something almost dishonest, and I mean, it's very likely to produce bad scholarship if you have to shed precisely what it is that's informing the work, right? And so the question that I was thinking through with the question of creolization is what would be the parallel to the social arithmetic argument? What would it mean to be 100% sociology, 100% history, 100% literature, rather than these little fragments that come together in very fragile unities, right? But then that, because I'm in political science, immediately raised political questions. And Yannick had mentioned that we were at Temple University until very recently, and Temple University is the center for Afrocentrism. And some of our most distinguished scholars were scholars of Afrocentrism, including Professor Molefe Asante. And for many scholars of Afrocentrism, Creolization is very conservative, right? Because what Creolization is dilution. That if you're in a fundamentally hostile relationship with a colonizing class, with a settler class, with a dominating society, to become anything like them is to become less yourself, right? It's to water down and compromise what shouldn't be compromised. And yet the difficulty, I think, with that argument is I think it borrows from the multicultural logic. Right? In other words, the difficulty is if you live in a place with the settler class, they've already transformed that world fundamentally, problematically. And they are there as a factor with which one has to contend. And similarly with hegemonic culture, you're not, if you move from Africa to the United States, unchanged by it. You can't be. You're a human being. And it's not that one, therefore, is saying that this is right, that this is good, that we want to be this. It's simply acknowledging this is now the terrain in which I have to live, in which I have to do what I have to do. And so when it comes to Creolization, while there is a political dimension to it, which I'll return to in a second, at one level it's primarily descriptive. It's an effort to actually describe what emerged in the birthplaces of the modern world, right? That if we look to the Caribbean, if we look to African coasts, what happens in those places where people converge, who are radically unequal, and who are fundamentally hostile to one another, is that they can't maintain a Manichaean world that is the ideological project of colonialism. What happens in all of those environments are people are remade by them, for better and for worse. Because in the end, what's been radically interrupted is all of the experiences leading up to that moment. They're in a new world, a new shared environment, right? And all of the genealogies and trajectories that led up to it are radically interrupted. There's a new trajectory here. And the example that I often use when I'm describing this is that if you think about the French language is transformed and charts a radically new trajectory in the island of Haiti that French, for all of the colonial endeavors that they were embarking on, didn't envision. And there's a sense that the French often are don't know what to do with Creole as one of the inheritances of the French language. And yet this is what happens when these dynamics emerge. And so at one level, what Creolization is describing is the complex interdependence that emerges in these environments and what comes from it at the level of language, et cetera. One thing that I think I need to sort of say immediately as qualification is that for many people, when I begin talking about Creolization, they think immediately of the Creole class, right? And a very specific Creole class, which is Europeans in the New World who set themselves up as the new embodiment of Europe in the New World. And they do that over and against a variety of other kinds of mixtures. In other words, what happens in many instances is there's a hijacking of the process of Creolization, and some people set themselves up as the embodiment of the Creole, right? But the irony is when you do that, you actually stop the process of Creolization and set up one form of mixture as a new purity, right? And so the Creole class in Latin America, in the US, they're Europeans who are born on US soil who want to continue for European control, but simply in their own hands. And they call themselves Creole to justify that very endeavor, but in fact they've radically interrupted the project of Creolization as I'm describing it. Because what they've done is they've set up a new exclusive identity that everybody is supposed to match, and everybody who fails to is to be marginalized, right? And so now in terms of the methodological and the political, is that what many people might take me to be saying, and might even take us to be saying in the context of the conference and talking about transdisciplinarity, is I would argue that Creolization is not something that we achieve by aiming to deliberately. In other words, when I talk about Creolization, many people say, but this is something that just emerges, and we look backwards and realize that this is what was achieved. But nobody was aiming to create Creolization in Jamaica or Haiti or Cameroon. It simply happened, right? And so many people would say, so what do you mean when you say we should Creolize method, or we should engage in transdisciplinary work? And the argument that I offer in answer is to say, Creolization, it is the outcome when we don't create obstacles to it. And let me explain, because that sounds completely cryptic, right? If one doesn't envision one's discipline as a purity, as an exclusive purity, where the model is mastery, loyalty, et cetera, then if one is actually interested in a particular problem, whether it's incarceration or whether it's slavery as depicted in film, one's going to, by necessity, have to draw on a variety of disciplines. And it would only be if one saw that as undisciplined that one wouldn't do it. And similarly, with political identity in the context of the Caribbean, it's only if one thinks one would be disowned by one's family for, as a Hindu woman, marrying a black man, that it would be an impossibility for that to emerge. If you're in Trinidad, say, as an East Indian woman in an island that's very African, why on earth would there not be East Indian African unions unless there were all kinds of prohibitions against it? And so the point is that Creolization, unless there are commitments against it, unless there are ideas that these mixtures are illicit, are not supposed to take place, will simply happen. And I think the same is true with transdisciplinarity. It's if one thinks that it's unrigorous to do work in this way, or if one thinks that one has to, as a scholar, be a master of something. You can only be a master of a limited number of things. That will create, obviously, obstacles to being able to do transdisciplinary work. And so there's this sort of odd move that I think one has to make with this work, is which I think you don't say, let's do transdisciplinary work. I think what one says is, let's do rigorous work. And rigorous work is, by definition, in some senses, inevitably going to be transdisciplinary in some sense, or creolized, if you want to use the language that I'm using here. And then, sort of, lastly, a few things. In terms of the question of political identity. One of the instances of this that I think is really interesting and very useful is Frantz Fanon's A Dying Colonialism, or L'Incinq de Révolution Algérienne. And one of the things that struck me when I was reading Fanon is that I had always assumed that it would be negritude writers who would be banned by the French government, right? But it's interesting that the French government was much quicker to ban A Dying Colonialism than it was to ban negritude writers. And it's interesting to consider why, right? Because in many senses, what A Dying Colonialism does is, in my view, to chart processes through which anti-colonial activity, anti-colonial movement, required the creolization of French forms through North African frameworks. Let me explain what I mean. I mean, there's several examples of it. But one of them is where Fanon talks about the use of the radio, right? And he says when the French first arrive in Algeria, the radio is a hostile instrument. Its sole purpose is to let French people feel that they have some kind of living contact with continental France. It's so that they can feel distant from everything that's actually surrounding them, right? And it would have programs that, in a Muslim setting were completely inappropriate in terms of the time when they were held and who they were addressing all at once. But he says at a certain point, there's a desire for movements across North Africa to be in contact with one another. And suddenly the radio seems incredibly useful, right? And so all of a sudden, the radios are gone. The batteries to operate them are gone. But then the question is, how I mean, these are diverse, this is a massive continent, right? And this is a piece of it that's still massive. How are people going to communicate across it? So suddenly the French language seems incredibly useful. This colonial language that people have not wanted to speak or master or make their own can become a very useful lingua franca. Right? And so suddenly it's not only the radio, but North African movements are connected through a radio where people are speaking French, right? And what's interesting is the French are appalled. I mean, very recently they were saying, why won't these Algerians speak our language? Why can't they master our language? And all of a sudden, the French that they're hearing is a very North African French that's aimed entirely at ousting the French. So there's a trajectory with which French is introduced that's suddenly radically interrupted and put to very different purposes, right? And it's interesting because coming from the framework of Afrocentrism, this is a very interesting counterexample where what's going on is things are made local, and made local in a way that's absolutely against the purposes of their initial introduction, right? And now just a couple sort of scholarly academic points. I think when it comes to Black studies, which is where I'm ultimately based, I do political science, but in many ways because of work in Black studies, one of the things that's interesting is the canonical texts in Black studies, how they relate to this question of disciplinarity, right? Which is that in Black studies as practiced in the US, the canonical figures are W.E.B. Du Bois, Frantz Fanon, C.L.R. James. I mean, there's a variety. But one of the things that's striking about the texts that they authored is they're thoroughly transdisciplinary, right? I mean, Du Bois doesn't do the work that Du Bois wants to do without using statistics, history, sociology, poetry. Often there are elements of theology thrown in. Because the point is, if you're looking at a social problem, how could you ever begin to do it justice without psychoanalysis, statistics, history, poetry. I mean, because if you also want to convey the gravitas of why it's important to do this, those other things just aren't sufficient, right? You need all of these things. And the same goes for a variety of these texts. The work simply requires it, right? And it's funny, Lewis and I began a tradition of watching mafia movies. Do you know mafia movies? Oh, around Christmas time, right? And so we finally got our daughter to sit down and watch The Godfather with us, which was a wonderful victory on our part. But we were talking about the character Vito Corleone, right? Because Vito Corleone is amazing. What a man, right? he's fantastic. But the thing that's interesting about each of his children is they each have one of his strengths, but not all of them together, right? So why am I blanking on his name? The eldest. Sonny is fiery. He's always having sex. He always wants to fight. He's passion, right? Unbridled passion. Michael is incredibly intelligent, but scarily so. It's all about rationality. He'll kill his own brother, right? And each of them has one of the pieces sort of as an ideal type and exaggerated, but not the combination, right? And there's something that we do, I think, when we're reading books in Black studies that's a little bit similar to The Godfather. We take these books that are ingenious because of what they bring together, and we take one strain and focus in on it, which is not a problem, but you get Michael and Sonny rather than Vito. Right? And it's interesting when it relates to the question of disciplinary training, because I know in political theory, the sense increasingly is that none of us should actually aspire to author the kinds of texts we study, right? We should aim to do secondary work on brilliant works, right? And many people think this is a necessary demotion, that we were finally kind of have come to terms with ourselves and, have gotten rid of our hubris. But in the end, most people are drawn to political theory because they want to author great texts of the kinds that brought them to it, right? Or the same goes for literature. And so I think at a certain extent, if we're talking about disciplines, we should remind ourselves of what it is that brings people to them to begin with. Because, and this is sort of where I'm going to end, is earlier Jean-Paul and Louis were talking about the question of power. And there were two very different conceptions of power being discussed, right? Because one conception of power is about exclusivity and gatekeeping. Who can get a job and why, right? And to get a job, you have to do work the way that I do it, which is the way that my mentor did it, which is the way that my mentor's mentor did it, right? It's all about blocking people out. And there's another conception of power, which is about generating things, making things happen, right? And this is something that Lewis didn't finish before he was able to get into it. But this is the God example, right? I mean, power is about enabling things to happen. It's about efficacy, creating things that would otherwise not have been there, right? And it's interesting when one thinks about this in terms of the question of disciplines, because there's one version of training where responsible training is enabling you to get a job, which means doing things in the most conventional, narrow way, safest way, et cetera, even if it doesn't actually work. I mean, that's the conception, is that this is responsible training, right? But the irony is that training is for an academy that for the most part no longer exists, right? And what I mean by that is it's an academy that's made up of specialists or hyper-specialists, where an English department has somebody who does this period in this country, or in the history department you have somebody who does Aztec history, but very narrow specializations. It's expensive to do that. I mean, in the West, universities can't afford to do that anymore. It was tied up with the project of empire and all of the wealth that came from it. It's not sustainable. Right? And I know in the United States now, just as our economy is radically polarized, where there's a tiny set of very rich people and then there's everyone else, the same is true with universities. There's a tiny set of incredibly rich universities that don't know what to do with their money, and then there's everyone else, right? And what's interesting is of the everyone else, there's a small set who want desperately to be like the small set of very affluent schools. And try as they may, they fail miserably. They simply don't have the resources to do it. And then there's another set that I think is linked to this alternative, more generative conception of power, who say, we're in a new moment. We're serving different students. This is an opportunity. The loss is an opportunity. What are we going to do instead? Right? And I think, this is one of the things that's interesting sociologically about the question of transdisciplinarity, is I think in many ways we need to go in this direction. We can't afford, even if we wanted to, I mean, financially, the alternatives, right? But then it poses important substantive questions, right? Which is that the model of the hyper-specialized university is one where rigor equals mastery, right? I mean, one deserves to be a professor if one's mastered a particular area of scholarship. right? This is, transdisciplinarity or creolization suggests something very different as the ideal, I think. And this is one thing I want to sort of bring as a question. Because earlier there were questions about, well, what then is rigor, right? And it seems that part of the move to do transdisciplinary work is to say we need a model of something of rigor that's not about mastery, right? Where the version of power, the version of authority is radically reconceived, right? And then one last point, which is Lucille earlier brought up Thomas Kuhn. And I wanted to just say something quickly about Kuhn, which is that I'm in political science, and in the United States, political scientists have what I call science envy, right? You're real, you're legitimate, you're powerful, you're authoritative if you're scientific, right? And in the Anglophone world, science is always used much more narrowly than the Francophone world, right? Here you have sciences humaines. We don't have any sciences humaines. We have biology, chemistry, you know, and whether or not physics and chemistry, et cetera, are useful for looking at the problems, you're supposed to try to pretend that you're doing them, right? And Thomas Kuhn makes a really interesting argument, I think, about Anglophone science, which is he says when science emerges is when the question of the paradigm of what we should study and how is entirely resolved. So you can have an entire community working away at one trajectory because all of the big questions, the fundamental questions have been settled. And so what he was saying is for fields like political science, you're never going to be scientific because whether you like it or not, much of the work is about asking about the paradigms that we're supposed to, in fact, do. But for these purposes, what I find interesting is that model of science does suggest how it is that scholars relate to one another. They're in a shared trajectory, the paradigm is settled, we're all working together for the advancement of progress. Right? Whereas transdisciplinary work, creolization work, theoretical work, I would argue, humanistic work, is always about asking about the paradigm, right? I mean, for us, the question of what progress is not settled. But then it does raise a question of, well, then how do we relate to one another, right? Because one of the things that disciplines do is they create shared literacies, they create associations where everybody always meets, they create obvious audiences. And one of the things with transdisciplinary work that's difficult and exciting is in many ways one's building one's audience, one's building one's community. But it does also raise an interesting question about how the work of transdisciplinary scholars should relate, how transdisciplinary scholars should relate to one another. And whether there's a different model of collectivity, just like there would have to be a different model of rigor that then is, emerges with it. And I'll stop there because I pose it as a genuine question.
Thank you
Sure.
very much. Est-ce qu'il y a des questions? Any questions, remarks, suggestions? Yep.
I would like to ask a question about the concept of creolization. How, from your perspective, what does it mean, or what are the differences with Edouard-Glissant? Because we know that Glissant has theorized a lot creolization. So, are there similarities or differences between your conception of creolization and Edouard-Glissant creolization?
Sure. Should I go ahead or?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. In many ways, I think that Glissant is more prescriptive. He's arguing for deliberate creolization in a way that I think is erroneous. In other words, I don't think one creolizes simply by trying. I think it emerges when one exhibits certain values and projects and commitments. And so that's the first, so that's sort of just a technical difference. But the other is, I think that Glissant romanticizes creolization in ways that are worrying, which may sound funny because I'm here advocating creolization, so you'd think I'm probably romanticizing it as well, right? But I think one of the things that's really important with creolization is that one can't control the elements that converge, right? And so creolization will look very different in Anglophone, Hispanophone, Francophone context. And simply the fact of mixture is not a triumph, right? It simply means that one has a different relationship to relationships than some of the alternatives, and I think a healthier one. But mixture in and of itself, I don't think is necessarily something to celebrate. Whereas I think Glissant makes the mistake sometimes of doing that. But but at the same time, I'm very indebted to Glissant. I don't mean to diss Glissant, not at all. And where I think he's especially astute is in arguing that the Caribbean for a long time was treated as very marginal, as an area of the world that one didn't need to study unless one was Caribbean or interested in New World politics. And he says, no, the Caribbean is the prototype of the modern and postmodern world. And I think he's absolutely right about that. And I think in many ways the work that the CPA is doing is taking that point and trying to build constructively from it. And linked to that is another point, which is I think that this is sort of me riffing a little bit on Glissant, which is that often in the European Academy, there's a lot of talk about cosmopolitanism, right? But cosmopolitanism is a very privileged discourse, right? It's a small set of people who move as cosmopolitans. But I think Glissant was right that there are a lot of people who migrate, and migrate to very cosmopolitan cities. And then in many ways, the most global citizens are often people who've migrated to global cities. And that just as there's a sort of almost disembodied cosmopolitanism of one kind, the other kind, I think, is really where we see what's emerging in terms of the global future. So.
Jane, I would have a question about what you've just explained. These elements which cannot be controlled, and which may converge.
Yeah.
That reminded me something about what you said earlier, understanding transdisciplinarity as a movement, basically, as a flux. But I was just wondering about the space in which that flux happens, right? Can we really say that things, just happen, right? That what we should have in mind is the question of rigor, and the objective of doing good work, Can't we think or at least envisage the possibility, of a resistance or a resurgence of the colonial power or of the empire, which makes that space where things happen shrink? I understand your argument about, creating one's collective, But, for having a collective, you need that space, and that collective might actually come to the point of vanishing, crushed by, social pressure, political power, very concrete and material, conditions, and we witness that, here, with what is happening, in the academic world, Actually, when you were comparing the way the humanities and the social and the sciences such as biology or chemistry were actually constantly compared in the U.S. and not so much in that analogical relation in France. Well, the academic world has changed, and we are actually requested to do the same type of production, as our colleagues in sciences, So then, I understand the project about, the political dimension of transdisciplinarity as a project, as a human and social project, with a theoretical dimension, But I'm a little bit, I'm just wondering about the conditions of the project, right? That is my first question. And then it's not really a question, it would be a remark. When you described what, creolization, not creolization, talking about creolization, and what assimilation was about in Jamaica and what whiteness was, as being, about exclusiveness. That definition of a political identity is exactly, you know, in my opinion, at least, you know, what Frenchness is about, right? Yeah. And then, you know, there is also the question of the cultural, I mean, part of those political conditions, you know, about how we deal with you know, space for flux, circularity, and transdisciplinarity. You know, there is also, you know, the cultural dimension, you know, and how we construct those, what you call social arithmetics and what I call identitary mathematics, you know, how one being something means that you cannot be something else, which is basically what, you know, the French society is actually requiring from, you know, its subjects, and what the university, you know, and disciplines are also reproducing in their methodology, you know. What do you think?
Yeah, lots of things. No, I'm reminded of well, two things immediately. I have a friend in the psychology department at our university who works on racism in the United States. He's a Black British man. And he was saying that when students are admitted to the program, they're wonderful writers. They have to write beautifully to be able to be admitted. And he said by year 3, they've turned them into terrible writers, right? Who write like other psychologists, right? They write like they're giving reports. And it speaks to, I think, this question, which is it's absolutely true. Neoliberalism is terrible for the academy. There's no question, right? And what I mean by that is all of the imperatives that are driving it have nothing to do with reality, truth, knowledge, creating a world that's livable, none of that, right? And so we're encouraged to do tiny, incredibly specialized work that speaks to other people who do the same tiny specialized work. And so there's this radical discrepancy between what students actually want to learn and what we're pressured to produce. Right? I mean, because to publish in most academic journals, you have to do stuff that's this has this breadth, right? But who wants to learn about something with this breadth, right? I mean, students want something very, very different. And so the reality of the space is shrinking is very real, right? But there's this amazing irony, which is that universities can't preserve themselves in that way. There simply aren't the resources to do it. And so we were in this crazy situation at Temple where the programs that were immediately cut to raise money were women's studies. I mean, they were all of the interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary programs that were in fact incredibly cheap, right? Because there's a tiny set of people doing everything. And they're doing it out of commitment and a labor of love. And they were cut for symbolic reasons. They were cut to say, we will cut. And these are the people we can cut with the least, with complete impunity, because what will come back at us is less. But it's a real, there's a real contradiction between the way that scholars are responding to the situation of necessity and scarcity and what ultimately I think is sustainable. Yeah. But it's absolutely true that, I mean, none of the pressures, I mean, all of the pressures are in the absolute obverse direction to transdisciplinarity. They absolutely are, right, in terms of producing things that will be cited in conventional indices, all that kind of stuff. And it's absolutely true politically. I mean, last night we were with Omar Bandera, and he was talking about how much pressure there is not to link Islamophobia and racism and anti-Semitism and homophobia, et cetera. I mean, and that's absolutely true as well for a whole variety of reasons. And so the question about the material conditions are very real. But I think what all of this illustrates is how dangerous it is to do this work, right? I mean, the reason there's so much commitment to discouraging this work is because if it were to emerge, it could actually foster a very different direction. And so pressuring people and terrifying people not to do this is necessary because the alternative is really transformative. And so in other words, the hostility to it is precisely an affirmation of its potential power, I think.
Okay. Yep.
Thank you very much for the presentation. Tying to the question of the conditions for the project, I'm curious and the issue of space. As I've been discovering a little bit the US reality, I've been very much impressed about how, well, I just know the reality of Boston, but how people, or like the academia, is very good in absorbing young people and, giving them tasks to keep the campus going, cooperating within the campus, all kind of things that in the past I was used to see in a totally different social reality, as being possible, sometimes making, let's say, some like pushing, making efforts, as being created in spaces that were outside the institution but in dialogue with it, which meant that young people had the possibility of like going in and out and not being totally absorbed, which in a sense would also challenge the economic justification for being absorbed in the academia as the only way to then enter the job market. Even though the thing I have in mind, of course, is in a social reality which is different from the US, where for some students is definitely the way to go to make a living, and it actually gives possibilities to, you know, survival, basically. So my question to you is if you are aware or have experience in the US of the possibility of creating spaces which are somehow outside of the institutional reality, but that are not challenged by other institutions, like I think police or like enforcement, for instance, where students can like somehow be out of the academia, or like take out from the academia, where they actually learn there, which I don't want to say it's bad at all, but like some preserve it and like develop it in other spaces beside the one of the academia and then the job market. If you see a little bit. And again, this is tied to the condition of for the project of transdisciplinary work and also meeting of identities in a sense. Because my feeling is also that in the US academia, basically identity is like the reflection of identitary policies. It is even enforced in a sense, thanks to like multiculturalism and courses on multiculturalism and then production of books on that, etc., etc.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It's one of the things that the right wing in the U.S. always does is to go after universities for precisely the reasons that you're saying. It's not only that students are radicalized there, but they really are the very few political spaces in the U.S. Because the vast majority of spaces, they're consumer spaces, not public spaces. And public spaces are so associated with black people in the United States that they're always the site of law enforcement. There's a deep hostility to anything public in the United States because it's seen as that which is used by people who can't opt or pay for better, right? And the one exception really was universities. And so for a long time, there's a long history of there being quite porous places. So communities around them sort of entering and leaving, or students who are at a university creating communes and, you know, experimental anarchic communities of all kinds. And so there was a lot of porousness. But there's more and more pressure for the university to be a direct channel to a job. And students are told by their parents constantly, you know, only choose what will translate into a well-paying job. You know, don't do that other stuff. And, you know, and so the number of people studying Black studies, women's studies, they're all plummeting because those things aren't seen as translating directly into employment. And similarly, a problem that many faculty have identified is that faculty tend to be more radical than students. If you bring a radical activist to campus, it'll be the faculty who are there and the students who are giving extra credit for coming. I mean, some will come, but the vast majority will be faculty, right? And I do think that that it's mirrored in terms of the space question by, I mean, it was something that I'd said earlier in the questions. I think that a lot of faculty are very quick to criticize identity politics and identitarianism, and yet protect their disciplines and their turfs in exactly those terms. And it really does shut down thinking, right? Because one of the points about the South African example is that if you play into the acceptable, if you had been recognizable following the existing fault lines, people would know immediately where to put you, right? If you were a Marxist, you were there, you know, there's sort of these recognizable camps. And one of the things that the identitarian relationship to disciplines do is we just replay the same battles. Instead of having fresh battles, if we're going to battle, let's at least battle about something fresh. You know, I mean, there'll be ongoing issues as well, of course. But there's a way in which the crisis response, I think, of many faculty, including left faculty, has actually exacerbated the problem rather than improved it, I think. You know, because there's a sense, I mean, you have faculty who are now nostalgic for 15 years ago. 15 years ago, we were nostalgic for 15 years before, right? But at least we had a little bit more as the sensibility, rather than saying, no, you know, we need a constructive response rather than a purely reactive one. But part of it does have to be, because there have to be spaces for these kinds of things to emerge. I mean, one of the ironies of a lot of the Caribbean islands is there were settler classes that were there, and then were there in small numbers. And so there were vibrant communities sort of that were semi-autonomous in certain ways in terms of the conditions of basic life. And universities used to be one of the very few places where people could come from very conservative communities and converge, and all kinds of things could emerge out of it that were very unpredictable. But there are very specific reasons for why. And I think part of the transdisciplinary argument has to also be about the spaces in which it can emerge, you know, and what needs to be protected and defended for that work to be feasible. And that's one of the things with the Caribbean Philosophical Association that's been interesting, is some of our members think that we should only be an activist organization. And so they're very critical when we're overly academic. And Louis and I have said, what are you talking about? We need to demonstrate that you can make a career out of doing work in this way. You need to be able to publish, you need to be able to get a job, you need to be able to get tenure doing this work. And so one of the things that's really necessary is to create the organizations that do that, right? And so the CPA, it's not, now it's big, but it began as a very small group of very senior achieved people and a bunch of young people. And we created awards and journals and, you know, and book series with the very express aim of saying, this is what actual thinking and scholarship looks like. Let's at least create a venue for it, because the academies are squeezing it out. And if this is what we're committed to, we do need to also create the infrastructure for it. It's not enough to do the work. We also have to do the organizational work, like this meeting today, right, where these conversations can actually take place, because otherwise they're pushed to the margins, even though those are the people who are thinking. And the people who want to have this conversation are the people who are really intellectuals in the actual meaning of that word. So yeah.
Est-ce qu'il y a d'autres questions?
Sorry, it's very specific, and it relates to what you said about Creole as language, and it's about Creole in South Africa, which I think you know, because I hear you lived there for a long time.
My folks are South African. I haven't lived there, but I grew up visiting.
There you go. I have a question regarding Afrikaans and the status of Afrikaans. I just show you an example. I was talking with a professor who's not South African but studies in South Africa, but in Joburg. And she came to visit me in Cape Town, and we had to talk, and she was like, yeah, well, you know, I was talking with those women that I picked up on the side of the road when I was traveling through the Eastern Cape, and they could only speak Afrikaans, and there were colored women that could only speak Afrikaans, and I felt for them. I felt so bad that they could only express themselves through the language of the oppressor. And I reacted so strongly to that, and I was like, no, Afrikaans is not the language of the oppressor. It is the language of the colored people, which is not true in a sense. It's because otherwise they would be speaking the language of Khoisan people. That's not. But still, for me and for the people whom I know speak Afrikaans in Cape Town, in the Cape Flats, etc. It's their language, and they have a very specific Afrikaans, and they have a very strong relationship with that language. And so, yeah, what do we make of that as researchers? Those tensions around, like, hegemony basically, and hegemonic uses of languages, and creolized languages as well.
Right. Yeah. No, it's a great question. And one sort of just transdisciplinary dimension of all this is I found when I was working on Creolization that it was really important to learn a lot of the linguistic work on Creolization, because while it's not politicized in the sense that a glissant or the literature work on Creolization is, it's actually teeming with really fascinating examples that really kind of push the concept in all kinds of really exciting ways. And it's just, I mean it as an example in the sense that I started working on this and realized very quickly that I needed to learn a lot of linguistics to do it right, you know? And it's funny that you mentioned Afrikaans, because when my brother and I were kids and my parents wanted to speak about us without our understanding, they either spoke Afrikaans, Hebrew, or Setswana, right? And we would always say, don't speak that colonial language when it was Afrikaans, you know, my brother and me. And so it's funny that, because now I realize exactly the question that you're posing to me is about me having said that. But because two things. One is that one of the things that I find most remarkable about South Africa is the range of English spoken and the range of Afrikaans spoken. That it's, in the U.S., the expectation, Americans are so lazy when it comes to language, right? Students complain if somebody speaks English with an accent. I mean, it's not enough that the person speaks English to them, right? And so it's always interesting in South Africa because there's so many different Englishes that are spoken. And so you really have to pay attention, right? And it also means that it's an environment where people are used to having to communicate creatively and having to work at communication. So it's already a very different environment. But the same is true of Afrikaans as with English. I use the example of English because my Afrikaans is, but it is true, the range of ways that it's spoken. And because this is the point about creolized languages, there's always this debate about which version of a Creole language should be standardized. And it's a really interesting debate, right? Because there's some people who say you should standardize the most urban versions because they're continually creolizing. They're continuing to change, so they best exemplify the process that produced them. And others say, no, you should standardize the version that's become isolated. So while it was once creolized, it's now become standard. Right? And I think the former is exactly right. I mean, I see all of the difficulties that it poses, but it's absolutely true with Afrikaans. I mean, Afrikaans is as much Dutch as it is indigenous African, right? But at the same time, the inequalities of those contributors are reflected in the language, right? That when it comes to things that are associated with authority and politics and reason, you see much more of the European influence. When it comes down to daily life and making it meaningful, most of the words and vocabulary are indigenous. And yet they have come together to create that thing. And that is a record of those relations. And so in other words, it's both and, right? I mean, it is both a colonial language because that was the condition. But the condition wasn't simply one of imposition and people responding passively. And that's also recorded in the language, and it will continue to change, for better and for worse.
Thank you, Jane.
Okay. Do I stay here?
No, stay here.
Okay.